Hi everyone and welcome. Just letting somebody in here. Let's do this. Okay. Good. Okay, welcome to everybody. Another exciting episode of Pirkei Avos, of the Ethics of Our Fathers, and to continue on our shir on where we left off last time. Last week we spoke about the pair that took over in the next generation, and they were Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shattach. We quoted the Mishnah in the name of Yehuda ben Tabai, where we spoke about that we should not make ourselves like the lawyers, and that when the litigants are standing in front of you, they should appear before you as Rishoyim, as wicked, and when they go away from you, they must appear as Zakoyin, as meritorious, Kibla Aleim Sadim, because they have accepted the din, they've accepted the judgment. Excuse me. So that was what we discussed last week. We're now going to move on to the Mishnah of Shimon ben Shattach. So if you're following in your Siddur, in the Chabad Siddur, it's on page 272, Art Scroll Siddur, page 546, and we are up to we're up to Mishnah number 9, Tes, number 9. So 272 in the Chabad Siddur, 546 in the Art Scroll, and you go down to Tes, number 9. We meet up with this man, this great sage, by the name of Shimon ben Shattach, or he's sometimes called Shimon ben Shetach. Shetach or Shattach was the name of his father. And Omer, he says, one should very, very much marbe, you must do a lot, to interrogate, to seek out, to check out the Eidim, the witnesses. And you must be very careful with your words. Shema mitoichem yilmedu l'shaker. Lest, or because from them, yilmedu l'shaker, they could learn to be false, to tell lies, to tell untruths. Now, it's very important to paint the background once again, and to see who Shimon ben Shattach was, and perhaps to give some context as to why it is that he is giving this particular piece of advice. He's telling us to be very, very careful to interrogate witnesses and to make sure that when we do that, that our words are absolutely true, and we must be very careful with the words that we use in the interrogation of witnesses. And why? Because from them they might come to tell lies. They might come to do the wrong thing and tell untruth, the sheker. Let's begin just by looking at, right up front in the beginning, let's have a look at something fascinating that we learn about, let's call it homiletically, when we talk about the letters and the construction of certain words in Torah. The difference between the word emet and sheker. Emet means truth. Sheker means the opposite of truth, a lie. A sheker is a lie. A shakran is a liar. Emet and sheker. If we take a look at the word emet, it's an amazing word that means truth, and it's comprised of 3 letters. We take a look at the word sheker. It means a lie, and it's also comprised of 3 letters. When we take a look at the word emet, we put it under the spotlight, we realize that the word emet is comprised of 3 letters, one that is right at the beginning of the alphabet, one that is right in the middle of the alphabet, and the third one, that's the last letter at the end of the alphabet. The Aleph is the first letter in the alphabet. The Taf at the end of the word Emet is the last letter in the alphabet. And the Mem is the middle letter. Mem for middle. Emet is beginning, middle, and end. It is a very, very balanced word. Add to that the fact that the Aleph of Emet, if we take a look at the letter Aleph, it stands with 2 feet on the ground. If we take the letter Mem of Emet, it's got a flat board on the bottom of the letter. It stands firmly on the ground. And if we take the letter Taf, the last letter of the word Emet, it's got 2 feet, 2 legs that are firmly planted around. It's very balanced. It can't be wobbled. It doesn't fluster. It's solid. Aleph, Mem, Tov, beginning, middle, and end. And the letters are absolutely firmly planted on the ground. They can't be ruffled. They can't be toppled. They can't be changed. When you take the word sheker, which means a lie, and you take a look at the 3 letters that make up sheker, the shin, now a shin comes to a point on the bottom, stands on 1 foot. The kuf has the 1 leg, the long leg that goes down underneath it, and the resh has 1 foot on the ground. Shin, kuf, and resh, 1 leg on the ground. In addition to that, shin, kuf, and resh come towards the end of the alphabet. We go, at the end of the alphabet, we go kuf, resh, shin, tov. It is almost the last letters, and they're mixed up. They're not in order. So what do we learn about a sheker? Is it's off balance. It's pinned on 1 foot. In addition to that, it's at the end of the alphabet and it's mixed up. It doesn't go in order. There is something very important about the difference between emet and sheker, just when we think about those 2 words. Now here he tells us that we must be very, very careful with the edim, with the witnesses, and we must be very careful in choosing our words carefully, that we should not bring anything or anyone to sheker, that we shouldn't bring anyone to lies. And what is he in fact talking about? Well, the Gemara, the Talmud tells us that Shimon ben Shattach had a very, very important reason for telling us what he did. And they say that it really all hinged on the fact that unfortunately, tragically, Shimon ben Shattach lost a son in a court case where witnesses had come and told lies and gave testimony that was afterwards withdrawn, but it was too late, and Shimon ben Shattach's own son was executed for a crime, for a matter that he didn't do, that he wasn't involved in. What had actually happened here? Shimon ben Shattach lived at the time of the big conflict between what were known as the Tzedukim and the Perushim, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, the Sadducees, who they were known as the Tzedukim, they wanted to, or they professed to have an obedience to Jewish law, but only Torah law, nothing from the oral law. Oral law was man-made, wasn't acceptable. These were the forerunners to the people who ended up in Qumran, where the Qumran caves are, and where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And it's thought that it was partially to this group that one Yashka, Jesus, actually joined at some stage. But be that as it may, there seems to have been an argument at the time going through the authorities. And remember, we're talking once again Roman domination, and a lot of our literature here coming from this time has this dominance of a Roman background. And so we've mentioned it before, and we certainly will mention it again. But it seems that they wanted to have parts of Jewish law amended to what they believed was correct, that in certain matters you checked out and you only believed on certain things, you believed one witness. Torah we believe and we know, especially in huge matters, you have to have two adim, you have to have two witnesses. And these two witnesses have to be checked out so thoroughly, interrogated properly. They have to have seen things from different standpoints. They can't have been, and they're not allowed to be related to each other. You know, the only time today where predominantly we know and we see the use of Adim, yes, of course, it's used in Beis Din. But thank God we're not in Beis Din all the time. We're not in a Beth Din, in a court of law. But when we see witnesses, you and I would see witnesses under a chuppah, right? They always call up two witnesses. Now you have two, what they call kosher witnesses. There are certain things that qualify the witnesses to be kosher witnesses. What are the kosher? What makes the kashrus of the witness? The witness has to be an age of majority. The witness has to be a person that the community knows is religious, is trustworthy from a religious point of view. You can't have a witness who isn't keeping to the law. So it's got to be someone who we know to be Shomer Shabbos, for instance, that he can't be someone who flaunts the fact that he doesn't keep the Jewish law. In addition to that, the witnesses are not allowed to be related to each other. So you can't have witnesses related to each other, nor can the witnesses be related to any of the parties. So when you call up two witnesses, for instance, under a chuppah, you can't have witnesses who are related to the chosin or the kala, the bride or the groom, and nor can the witnesses be related to each other. It always used to be in the big shuls that therefore the two witnesses were always the rabbi and the chazan. Why? Because the rabbi and the chazan invariably, usually, were not related to each other. In fact, usually they didn't see eye to eye in the first place. But the rabbi and the chazan were not related to each other. And hopefully they were not related to the bride and the groom for this matter. And therefore they could qualify as being A, renowned by the community as being religious. Number two, not related to each other. And number three, not related to each of the parties involved in this transaction, in this case. Now, witnesses in a court case have to have the same kind of qualifications. You can't bring along a witness who's your son to come and give testimony that you did this or you said that or whatever. Why? He's postulatus. He's too close. What's he going to say? He's obviously going to be on your side. It would be wrong for him not to. You can't have somebody come along where two people who are related to each other, where they're going to influence each other, are going to come along. And number three, we've got to make sure that these people are upstanding citizens. The community knows that these are people who are trustworthy. Can't just bring anybody to be a witness in a court of law. So therefore, in many cases, it was very, very difficult to prove a court case because you needed witnesses. You come along and you say, he killed him, he did that, whatever. You can't just bring that. And a person was not believed on themselves either. Now, the Talmud explains that there was a whole sequence of events, and I hope I get this right, it went something like this. That Shimon ben Shattach, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, remember we spoke last week about Yehuda ben Tabai, who was the Nasi. Shimon ben Shattach was the head of the Sanhedrin. So he was the head of the court of justice. By the way, incidentally, they also mentioned that he had a little business on the side, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But Shimon ben Shattach once sat in a court case where there was witchcraft that they were trying to stamp out. Now, it was the original, I suppose, witch hunt, where they found a number of women guilty of witchcraft that carried a death penalty. And these women, several of these women who were practicing sorcery and witchcraft were sentenced to death by the court of Shimon ben Shattach. Their mishpachas, their families, we're told, trumped up certain charges against Shimon. They said they're going to teach him a lesson. They trumped up certain charges against Shimon ben Shattach's son, and the case was brought, and they withstood the test of the court, and the court found in their favor, and they had lied. And in fact, by the time it was brought to the attention, it seems that Shimon ben Shattach's son was already executed, and it came out that they had actually lied. Their testimony was false testimony. So we understand from this point of view now and on many different reasons and levels here, that it's pretty obvious that Shimon ben Shattach would make a statement that he's saying we've got to be very, very careful with Eidim. We've got to be very careful with witnesses. We need to check them out very, very carefully. You've got to make sure that you're that you're very, very careful in checking out the witnesses. So he's telling us this, A, because of the terrible personal experience. B, because he needs to lay it out that that a mistake had been made, and perhaps had there been better scrutiny and had they checked it out really, really properly, they would have found that these people were involved with a previous case, and they might have found a way of disproving what they were really saying, and he would have saved the life of his son. So this was some very, very bitter personal medicine Shimon ben Shattach is telling us here about. And perhaps then on a broader view, the fact that he was also at the time fighting against these tzdukim, these Sadducees, these believers, or the people who propagated only belief in Torah law, who were trying to put to the fore the fact that only one witness needed to be believed in a certain matters. Shimon ben Shattach had very, very personal reasons for making sure that there were eidim, that there are witnesses. No, you can't accept one witness. There are always going to be two witnesses. He tells us you've got to be very, very careful in checking out the witnesses and the veracity of the witnesses. Not only checking out, are the witnesses, is their testimony correct, but let's check out the background of the witnesses as well and see that they are proper, that they are correct. This is not a joke. You can't take it lightly, and you've got to be very, very careful in how we check out witnesses, any situation from a Jewish point of view. Now he goes on and he tells us that we've got to hevei zohir bidvarecha. You must be very careful with your words. So once again, he could be right here giving us instruction to judges in a court. He says, be very careful with your words. Now, I think I explained to you last week that in a Jewish court of law, the lawyers don't lead the evidence. The lawyers don't speak on behalf of the person who is being brought here and accused, or a litigant in a case. And in fact, they don't do a cross-questioning. You know, if you've ever seen or you've watched, I guess, court dramas, or you've read books along those lines, we see that if you've got a good lawyer can get you off on a technicality or whatever. Or the lawyers can lead the evidence. They can get the people in the witness box to say things that they later may regret, to perhaps say things that they're not sure of, to perhaps say things that are not necessarily true. Why? Because they lead them down a certain path. There's a certain leading of the evidence. There's a certain way that they ask things. Now, here he's giving us a warning that we've got to be very careful, because the people who are asking questions in a Jewish court of law are the judges themselves. And the judges have to be very, very careful with their words. Because if a judge puts in a certain word in a certain way, and maybe even with a certain tone, the witness or the people, the litigants themselves, might feel in a way that they've been trapped, that the judge has kind of prejudged this, that he's already made up his mind. And then they start making up stories or lies or whatever to cover their tracks, to say, hey, 1 second, he's thinking that way, let me try and prove it this way, and so on. And people can get themselves trapped in what we call sheker. Now, sheker, as we said right in the beginning, is flimsy. It's flighty. It stands on one leg, and it's a bit mixed up. And very, very often, in courts of law, in many, many court cases, you can trap a person by the lie that they tell. And very often, people have got trapped by lies, even when they are 100% not guilty. And why? Because they felt that they needed to defend themselves. They needed to explain something. Imagine a person needs an alibi for where he was at a certain time, certain place. He's accused of doing something and he needs an alibi. He needs to have that alibi. So he works it out. Perhaps it's not true, but he makes up a story and he gets somebody else to back him up. But as they start questioning it, they find that the alibi is not true. Now, why did he make up the alibi? I don't know, he didn't want his wife to know where he was. And therefore he made up the alibi that wasn't absolutely true. It can get a person into huge trouble. It can get a person to face, God forbid, even a death penalty. Why? Because he told a lie. And once one tells one lie, so one lie leads to the other lie. And it's flimsy. It doesn't stand firm. It's not going to stand up to scrutiny. So a judge has to be very, very careful that he doesn't plant in the eyes, in the minds of the Eidim, a certain way of thinking, because that certain way of thinking can lead them down a certain path, and it can get the Eidim, it can get the witnesses to elaborate on their story. What do they call it? Embellish the story, make the story grow a couple more legs, in order to feel that you're planting it better. This is where the expression comes from, that stories grow legs, that it's a sheker, it stands flimsy on one leg, you grow some more legs, and you make it stand a little bit more firm. Perhaps this is what he's alluding to. Be very, very careful that the judges don't get the Eidim to tell lies, because that is going to discredit not the Eidim, but it's going to make the whole case come crashing down. Now, of course, Pirkei Avos, as we've said many, many times, is not just about courts of justice, and we're not just talking about dayanim, we're not just talking about judges, and we're not just talking about litigants, and we're not just talking about Eidim. We're talking to you and me. We're talking about people. What are we actually talking about here? And how does this Mishnah apply? How could it be applied to each and every one of us? You know, I've often told, and I think that I've probably told many of you the story as well, of the, excuse me, of the fellow who goes into a restaurant in Tel Aviv, and he sees that there's a big sign outside that says kosher, and he goes into the restaurant and he sits down and he's about to order when he starts looking around and he says, hey, 1 second, just judging by what's going on in this restaurant, the pictures on the walls and the people around and the types that are in this restaurant, I wonder if I'm in a kosher restaurant at all. And he goes up to the counter and he asks to see the mashgiach. Could I please see the mashgiach? Could I please see who's in charge of the kashrus of this restaurant? And a big fellow comes out, and he's got long hair with his hair in a ponytail, and he's got earrings in his ears, and he's got tattoos all over his face and this and that or whatever, and he's wearing like a vest, and he is very muscular, very well built, and he looks like the type of guy you wouldn't want to meet on a dark alley. And he says, yeah, what? He says, I was to see the mashgiach. You're the mashgiach. He says, no, I'm not the mashgiach. I'm the owner of the restaurant. Why do you want to see the mashgiach? He says, you got a sign there that it's kosher. I just want to check out that it is really kosher. I want to see the mashgiach. I want to know that it's really kosher. This fellow goes over to a curtain and he pulls back the curtain and he points to a picture on the wall. He says, you see this picture on the wall? And there, sure enough, is a rebbe-looking face, a face of a tzaddik. He says, you see that? That's my father. He says, do you think that with a father who looks like that, do you think I'll be running a treif restaurant? The fellow says, listen, I've got to tell you, I would probably be a little more confident if you were in the picture up on the wall and he was behind the counter. So we've got to know that atmosphere can create certain impressions as well, and perhaps suggest some of our sages that what we're actually talking about when we talk about this Mishnah, the Eidim that we're talking about, are the Eidim that we don't really realize are there all the time. And what are we talking about? You know, people, when they're out in public, when we're in front of other people, perhaps we behave in a certain fashion. When we've got others watching, perhaps we show just how diligent we are in our davening or in our learning or in our behaviors and so on. When we go into the privacy of our own private spaces, maybe we don't behave in a way that the Yidden used to say is epis according. We don't behave correctly. We're not exactly as frum in the privacy of our own private daladamas as we are when we're out in public. And they suggest that this perhaps is what Torah teaches us can be the Eidim witnesses, because we talk about the walls of your house bearing witness. The walls of your house will bear testimony. And a Jew has to know that just the fact that you're not in public doesn't mean that you're not under scrutiny, that you're not being watched, that Hashem can't see you. Hashem can see, and the walls of your house can see, and we've got to be very careful that the walls of our house bear the right testimony. Now, it's not just that the walls are watching you, but your walls are being watched. You walk into our house sometimes, and you see certain things up on the walls, and it tells you something about the person, tells you something about the people. I'll never forget, as a young man, I came out here to South Africa, and I was interviewed for a job in a shul, and I was asked to go to the president or the chairman's private office somewhere in town, and I went there for my first interview, and I walked in, and he closes the door, and behind his door, as he closed the door in the interview with me, now he's the chairman of a great shul, and he's interviewing a young rabbi. Behind the door, there is a picture that you and I wouldn't want up in never mind anywhere. You wouldn't want it in your bathroom. You wouldn't want it in your garage. It was grob. It was uncouth, and it certainly didn't belong in the on the back door in the office of a president or a minister. Or what do you call it? A chairman of a shul. Needless to say, I declined the job even before it started or whatever, because I found this abhorrent. But you've got to remember that the walls of your house bear testimony. The things that you have up on your home, the things that you have up on your walls, the pictures that you have, the decor, the decorations, the things that you have, all of these things add to a picture that actually is painted of you. And you've got to remember this as well. And so our sages tell us very, very clearly, the walls of your house will bear testimony. When you walk into a home and you look around, you can actually tell something about the people who live there. It's not just that in the future, those walls are going to speak and they're going to say, oh, this one committed this crime here, and this one said Lashon Hara in this room, and that one. That's perhaps a step further. That's perhaps even a step too far. But just the walls themselves, the type of things that you have up, the things that you have in your surrounds, the type of atmosphere that you have, are they kind? Are they nice pictures? Are they things that are beautiful? Do you have Jewish art? Do you have stuff that's pertinent to the type of atmosphere that should be in a Jewish home? Or do you have otherwise? That's the kind of Eidim, that's the kind of witnesses that perhaps you have. And here, perhaps, Shimon ben Shattach is telling us something really, really fine. You must be You must be very, very careful in checking out those witnesses. Make sure that those witnesses are clean and pure and good, because maybe by the words that you say, and here perhaps we could suggest the Lashon Hara or lack thereof, Yilmedu l'shaker, those things can come to bear false witness against you, to tell things that perhaps doesn't clearly define what you are, because that's what they've seen. They've seen a person who perhaps is dishonest, or they've seen perhaps a person who hides who he actually is or she actually is. And this is what we really have to be careful of. So Shimon ben Shattach tells us, be very, very careful. Witnesses, whether they're witnesses in court, witnesses, whether they're witnesses in your home, these witnesses need to be checked out very, very carefully, and don't allow them to bear false witness against you. It could be devastating. I look forward to speaking to you again next week, same time, same place, in another exciting installment of Pirkei Avos Shir. Thank you for listening today, and I wish you all a great week.
Thank you.
Next week, Shavuot.
Oh, you're right. You are right. How did I not even think of that? 2 weeks' time. Apologies. We will not be on next week. We will be on in 2 weeks' time. Thank you for the reminder. Shkayach.
Thank you,
Keep well,
Rabbi.
everybody. Take care.